Hi, everyone. I'm going to adjust this. Thank you, Roberta. That was wonderful. I'm sorry I had to step out for a minute while you're talking. I've got a bit of a cold and I had to do a last minute. Anyway, you don't need to know. So hi, everyone. My name is Emily. I'm originally from Corner Brook. As Stephen said, I just finished my master's at York University. I went to MUN for my undergrad. And I'm currently living in happy Valley-Goose Bay. I went there for my fieldwork last summer. I loved it so much. I keep finding excuses to come back. So that's where I live now. The title of my thesis is Health, History, and Identity, Understanding Resistance to the Muskrat Falls Project through Local Perceptions and Experiences in Central Labrador. It's a bit of a mouthful. My supervisor likes to make fun of me for having terrible titles, so that's the shortest one I could get. And so basically I wanted to just better understand how people in Labrador felt about Muskrat Falls, how they experience it, what meaning it has in their lives. And I thought the best way to do this was to sort of understand their perception, so both how they understand the dam and what it means for their environment, and also their experiences. And by experiences, I mean both the individual, but also the collective and sort of historical experiences around development in Central Labrador and how that plays into how they understand that the dam is going to influence their lives and also resistance against the project. And then also to know, what does all this mean for the well-being of the community? Like Naria, I'm in development studies, so we like to ask questions about, what is a good society? What does development mean anyway? And how can we work towards better societies that are good for the people that live in them based on those people's terms? So I guess well-being is kind of my way of looking at development or a good society in that regard. And I wanted to do it by talking to the people who live most closely to the project, who are the most directly affected. So what I did is I did semi-structured interviews with 17 people living in Upper Lake Melville or Central Labrador in the communities of Happy Valley-Goose Bay, Northwest River, and Mud Lake. About half the people I interviewed were people who identified as land protectors or as members of the Grand River Keeper, people who were actively involved in the resistance during the fieldwork period. And the other, which I should say was about May to October of 2017. And the other half were more general members of the community. Some of them had attended the MATSA protests in October 2016 in solidarity, but they were typically people who were a little bit less visible in the community in terms of actively opposing the project or certain aspects of the project. And that's because I really wanted to understand how these land protectors were being impacted in their perspective, but I also wanted to see how maybe that was similar or dissimilar to people in the community. And I found that no matter who I talked to, there were a lot of very similar themes. Themes that keep coming up a lot, that came up in Jessica's research this morning, came up in my research. And so I was able to capture a lot of very diverse perspectives, but it's interesting how even amongst those perspectives, I had people aged 19 to 89, I had students, I had elders, I had business people, I had a little bit of everyone, how there were still similar narratives and themes that kind of came up throughout. And I also included participatory observation. So basically, I wasn't only informing my work based on the interviews. It was also about just the life of the community, living there, going to gatherings, going to things around Muskrat Falls, going to court sometimes when land protectors were going through court, getting to know it kind of outside of just the interview process, but also to know it sort of on a community level, and to sort of incorporate my understanding from my whole experience, not just my technical data. And so I asked very general questions to people about Muskrat Falls. I didn't want it to be specifically about my academic interests or my understanding. I kind of wanted the discussions to take shape based on the person I was talking to and what was meaningful to them. And this is kind of an important thing, I think, in research, because historically, especially working in Indigenous communities, scholars show up and they've got an agenda and they like to hear all this cool stuff that Indigenous people have to say and extract their knowledge and write a report on it, and then they never come back and no one ever hears from them. And you're like, where did that knowledge go, and who's benefiting from it? So that was one way that I kind of wanted to ensure that I was helping to tell the story, I guess, through Labradorians' eyes and not just through my own. And obviously that's not something that's easily remedied. I was born and raised a settler Newfoundlander, and I have ancestors from both Newfoundland and Labrador, and so I think it's important that we talk about that, especially in research, especially in Labrador and in other Indigenous communities, because it's something that's kind of, it has a very problematic history, and it's working its way through. So basically, I asked people very general questions, and I wanted to talk to people of all backgrounds who live in Upper Lake Melville. It's a very culturally diverse place. Inuit, settler and Southern Inuit, people who are a little bit of all those things, people who are Labradorians, people who are multiple things. So I think it's important that the research also reflects the diversity of that place. And that I kind of talked about it, like I said, through the perspectives of people who maybe haven't been considered fully, such as Labradorians, such as Indigenous peoples, as we've been talking about for the past 2 days. And like Roberta said yesterday, I thought this was very true. She said, you know, when it comes to the river, we are the experts. And that is 100% true. I can't even tell you how many interviews I did where I was just sitting there like, wow, this person knows so much about the ecology of Lake Melville and the Churchill/Grand River, and that is just incredible. So it's absolutely true. And I might not say much that's totally different from what people have been saying for the past few days, because, you know, Denise, Tracy, all these folks have been getting up and sharing their perspectives. So I don't want to say that I'm speaking for them, or I don't want to, like, you know, take what they're saying or take away from it, but rather just to add to it. And I kind of get the advantage and the privilege of getting to speak to lots of people when they're sort of in an anonymous forum, and they can kind of talk a bit more freely than they might be able to when they're speaking in front of an audience. So unlike Jessica, I was unable to get sort of permission to name my participants. I had to keep them anonymous, which I kind of wish I could have named them because what they said was so brilliant, but basically it's going to be mostly anonymous stuff. So now that you know what I did, once I coded all of my data, my interviews were all like several hours long. They were wonderful. There were two main themes that kind of came out. And the first theme I should say is that there was a lot of discussion around sort of the political and historical dimensions around resource development in Central Labrador and around Muskrat Falls, and how people there feel that there's been a pattern of sort of external imposition onto their territory by whether it be, you know, government actors from Newfoundland or outside companies kind of coming in and using the resources, and local people, or all the local people, are not necessarily consulted. And this was something that people made reference to the Upper Churchill, to when the Hudson's Bay Company was in town, to other resource projects where it was local people were never fully involved and never had full autonomy in terms of having a say, and it was often external organizations that were sort of doing this. So people talked about that a lot, and that's very interesting, but I can't talk much more about it today because I have to focus on my second theme, which is kind of what I wanted to talk about for this panel, because we heard from Roberta about all of the sort of environmental spin-off issues, and we heard from the two professors about issues around the North Spur. And I kind of wanted to talk about how those risks affect people on a personal level, and what people told me about what this means, because we talk about the issues a lot, but I think it's really important to talk about this isn't really a hypothetical for most people living in Upper Lake Melville. It's actually kind of a lived reality. And while some people are not concerned about these risks, a lot of people are very concerned about the risks, and they have to live with this each and every day. So that's kind of the second thing the second theme was all about people's personal sense of health and safety and well-being, and how Muskrat Falls is kind of, in a lot of different ways, sort of worn on people's well-being and denigrated the well-being of the community. Maybe not for everybody, but for a lot of people in different ways. And so the three sort of main ways that I found this happened were around social and economic changes to the community, fear and stress related to perceived environmental risks, and environmental changes and loss of ways of life. I'm going to talk about the first two kind of briefly, or the first one most briefly, but I just want to make note of how people talked about Muskrat Falls isn't just, you know, I'm worried about methylmercury, I'm worried about the North Spur, I'm worried about my power bills, but it was also things like stepping out your front door and seeing Nalcor trucks all over the community, seeing new people that you've never recognized in the community where you lived there for decades and you used to know everyone by name, and seeing the price of housing going up, families who've got parents got great jobs and they can't afford to rent a house for their family because the prices of rental and housing has gone through the roof. All these little ways that sort of add up and really kind of change the atmosphere that people who've lived there for a long time have to live with. And that sort of over time kind of creates tension and stress for the community. Also, people would tell me anecdotal evidence about things like more expensive drugs coming into the community, violence against women increasing. I don't have any hard data to back that up, but this was sort of the narrative that people were telling me, that they're really concerned about all these things and all these changes that they'd witnessed. And also that it kind of brought about tension between interpersonal tension, because you've got some people in the community who perhaps are making good money off the dam working there, some people who are adamantly opposed, some people who are somewhere in between, and some people who have got good jobs there, but then they lose their jobs and then they're in financial stress, and sort of all these different tensions between people who are neighbors and friends and family members. And suddenly, because it's created kind of this inequity in the community, and because some people are uncomfortable with resistance and with people being outspoken because it's sort of a new thing. And whereas other people are doing this because they have such a strong sense that they need to and they have to do this to protect their communities, it just becomes a really interesting and also difficult tension for some people because they've got to reconcile with these sort of already existing fault lines in the community, but this sort of exacerbates it. The second type of, I guess, well-being. Can you all hear me? Okay, am I talking too fast? No? Okay, you can wave if I am. The second part, like I said, is fear and stress about environmental risks, and this was largely about the North Spur stability. Some people felt pretty safe. They're like, I'm sure the dam's fine. You know, I would like there to be an emergency response in place. This was last summer, so there wasn't. Now there is. I've got an app on my phone that's basically like, if there's a dam break, we will tell you, or a forest fire, or what have you. But it's just interesting that a lot of people in Happy Valley-Goose Bay have that now. And so for some people, it was not so serious, but for other people, it was very serious. And I think it's really telling that the most frequently mentioned concept across all my interviews, I did 17 interviews, and the term stress was mentioned 50 times. And I think by every participant, if not most of them. Participants explained the entirety of Muskrat Falls as an experience that was riddled with stress, emotions, and strife, either experiencing it in themselves or witnessing it in other people. And so people talked about how surreal it felt to find out that their homes were in the projected flood zone in the result of a flood or of a dam breach, not only because of potential for a dam breach or what have you, but also just because you are altering the way that that river has flowed for hundreds of years. And so that creates change. And so that's why a lot of people in the community of Mud Lake are wary about what happened to them and aren't trustful of this assessment that the dam didn't cause the flood, because they're saying, well, you know what, the dam got put up the year, or started holding back water the year that we got flooded, and we've been here 200 years and it's never happened. So you can understand why people are wary of that and why people feel like they're not really sure. They're very concerned about not just it breaking, but also about just the way that that's going to change the water and how that's going to have multiple effects. One quote from someone who was worried about the North Spur said to me, "The North Spur is a threat. It's a ticking time bomb. Eventually, it may give out. I think it will give out. I know it will. I live in the valley and I live in the flood zone and I'm frightened to death. Most nights I can't sleep. In the middle of the night, if I hear something, it wakes me up and I'm frightened to go back to sleep. I go to bed at night ever thinking, am I safe? And it's really hard." For people in Mud Lake, the stress was less about what if and more about what if this happens again? And what if it happens really quickly and not, I mean, it was still pretty sudden when it happened in May of last year, but what if this is more of a flash flood or an extreme event? And because they've already gone through leaving their homes once, it's traumatizing. And I've met some people, especially older people, who are like, I can't, you know, I'm from Mud Lake, I live there, but I've been living in the valley ever since, or been living in Goose Bay ever since, because I don't want to go back there. And I was only able to interview one person from Mud Lake, unfortunately, because I think that their story is very important. And I know some of the land protectors did a series of interviews with them, which are all online if you want to hear more. But this participant said to me, living downstream, everything is a worry. If the water's too low, what's going on upstream? If the water's too high, what's going on upstream? If there's extra debris in the water, what's going on upstream? Is it going to break? And will it break in the daytime when we're all out and about, or in the nighttime when we're asleep? Will it break during the freeze up or in the middle of the winter? What's going to happen in the spring of 2018? You know, there's a sense of eeriness now looming over the community, and it's not a good feeling, because at one point you would always drive into Mud Lake and you would breathe with this feeling of, you're home. But now we drive in and we see garbage and we see houses lifted off their foundations and porch lights still not on because people still can't get home and the vacancies are everywhere. So I just wanted to talk about how that's not just an issue of what if, but it's also an ongoing stress for people. And the last theme, which I think is one of them, is important and is very similar to kind of what Jessica talked about this morning, is around environmental change and fears about losing ways of life in the region. Excuse me. The most obvious health impact when we look at it from that lens of the Muskrat Falls project would be the potential increase in methyl mercury. That's sort of the thing that sounds very scary, and that's sort of like an obvious health issue. If people end up continuing to consume wildlife from the Lake Melville region, at the time of fieldwork, it wasn't really known if this was going to become a reality or not. And as we know, the provincial government currently has the independent assessment independent expert advisory committee's recommendations on methylmercury mitigation, and we're not sure what's going to come of that yet. At the time, people weren't sure if people would ever come to be contaminated with methylmercury or be poisoned by methylmercury, or if people would change their dietary habits, it would never occur, or if it would never occur in the ecosystem. Things were still a little bit up in the air. But even if methylmercury never becomes an issue physically or is never measurable in people's bodies, the worry and fear associated with the potential risk was already real. It already is real and has already had an effect on people's health and well-being in terms of worrying about the future of their communities and their future to eat their wild foods. The fear of being poisoned by methylmercury was in front of many people's minds. The alternative would be to give up consuming country foods or consuming them less. Some people talked about, if this comes to be a reality, having to make really difficult hypothetical choices, or scenarios such as maybe deciding to feed non-country foods to young people who are more susceptible, and maybe allowing older people or oneself to continue eating the foods because you don't want to give them up, and it's really expensive to not be able to have your country foods, but you don't want to subject mothers and young children to it. So these are really tough choices that people are worried that they're going to have to make. Having to balance the advantage of the affordability and the availability of country food while also not bringing harm to your loved ones. But losing country foods is about a lot more than feeding one's family or the economic. Participants explained that if they were to lose this, it would have serious detrimental effects to the personal health and well-being and would be a cultural loss. Inuit, Southern Inuit, Innu, and other Labradorians consume country foods as part of their traditional land-based subsistence harvesting practices, and this includes hunting, fishing, sealing, trapping, berry picking. And research has demonstrated that when Indigenous communities transition away from their country and traditional foods, it's been associated with physical and mental health issues for both Innu and Inuit in Labrador, and also lots of communities across Canada. And we've seen in both Grassy Narrows First Nation and White Dog Independent Nations Reserve, both in Ontario, that when in fact mercury comes to contaminate people, there's very, very severe physical, psychological, and social health consequences, which are quite severe and inhumane. But even if it's not necessarily a reality or a measurable reality, it's been shown that Indigenous communities have increased rates of things like cancer, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and others when they transition from wild foods, and that when environmental change or industry causes doubt in people's waters and in their environments, the fear and stress that comes along with that causes severe psychological distress as well. So it's not just about whether or not people are getting contaminated, it's about a much bigger picture than that. Naria talked about this morning when she talked about how often when we look at the patterns of where environmental risks are taken in Canada around large projects, it's often Indigenous communities or other marginalized communities, and this is true across the world. All the cases I've read of major hydro dams, when there's issues with them, which there usually is, it's always Indigenous communities, almost always, because they live so closely to the land and because they often live in remote areas that are impacted and that are either told you have to leave, or that see their fishing or their ways of life completely changed, or have, so in some cases, literally just been standing, and then a reservoir just starts flooding and they've just got to leave their communities. Like, that's happened all over the world. So participants explained to me that hunting and fishing and being on the land is an integral part of their way of life. It connects them to the land and the waters, and also gives them a closer connection to the wildlife and other living things, to each other and to their ancestors. Living off the land is a way of life for people of all backgrounds in Labrador, both Indigenous and settler. And when this is compromised, their cultures are compromised. As one Inuk mother said, "I want my children to have their culture. I just want them to have healthy waters, healthy food, to have a healthy future, and not to be living in the pollution this project will leave behind. Everything is at stake. Our lives, our culture is at stake, our food chain is at stake." Other participants, particularly those who identify themselves as Inuit or as Indigenous, felt that the Muskrat Falls project was akin to losing the river or killing the river or poisoning the river, because to see the river changed in that way, to see the ecosystem change in that way, was disrupting and cutting off all the life that depends on it, and also the peoples and cultures that depend on it. I've got a couple of quotes to talk about this. I can find them. I'm going to get lost now. How am I doing for time? Am I taking too much time? Okay. One participant said, I think for me, it's the whole impact of it. I just have in my mind's eye just the changing of that river's course. Some people warn that we shouldn't anthropomorphize our physical landmarks, but to me, that water in that river is a living being. To me, it's painful that its course would be altered in a man-made fashion, and I really disagree with that. Another person said, that river holds an incredible amount of sacredness and history and culture. It's a powerful river, and if you have time to be on it or next to it, the first time I remember I went to Muskrat Falls, it was tangible. I never before had a feeling where the spiritual presence was so strong. So this kind of shows how important Muskrat Falls and the river are to people living there. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I don't want to keep you too much longer. But so it's not just about whether or not the North Spur fails, whether or not we see people with elevated methylmercury risks. It's about protecting this environment and these cultures and this way of life for future generations. And this is something that is incorporated into a lot of Indigenous worldviews and beliefs. Deborah McGregor explains this when she says, Indigenous views of development are based not on taking, which is what we do with often with natural resource projects, but on giving. Indigenous people ask themselves what they can give to the environment and their relationship with it. The idea of sustaining, maintaining, and enhancing relations with all of creation is of the utmost importance from the Indigenous point of view. And as Neria said this morning, and a few of us have said, it's kind of very obvious that the proponents of the project don't really understand that it is such a vital part of people's being, and they don't really understand that need for protection. Rather, the land is sort of used as a resource and is something that's just there for the taking. So in the context of Muskrat Falls, project proponents maintain that no one will be poisoned by methylmercury, implying that either the projected effects are inaccurate or that if they occur, they'll be mitigated against through consumption advisories or something of the like. This simplistic understanding dichotomizes the issue into either contaminated or not, and does not fully encapsulate the way in which the potential contamination of country foods already has and will affect people living in the region, and the ability of future generations to continue living in relation to the land and the water as they and their ancestors have for years. Proponents have also said that the North Spur is safe, but not all people in Labrador trust this information, and the fear that they are experiencing is very real. Labradorians are told that the dam is a good thing, that it will create jobs, but then they see inequity in income between peoples and their communities and how the cost of living and the social fabric of their community has changed over time. The compounding effect of all these factors, the changing environment, feelings of oppression from being silenced through the court system or through interpersonal conflict, the fear of flooding and of changes of the river, the sort of sense of ecological grief to lend from Dr. Ashley Console and her colleagues in Rigolet and elsewhere, and Jessica mentioned this morning, this concept around feeling this grief and the stress, all of these factors kind of combined, and they sort of affect people in individual and collective ways that undermine their well-being. For some, this was experienced as a collective community trauma, one that was articulated through the framing of colonialism or other forms of oppression and injustice. The distress brought about by Muskrat Falls was explained in reference to other forms of colonial oppression for peoples in the region, past resource developments, the legacy of the Hudson's Bay Company, residential schools, erosions onto their culture, and so on. So the cultural loss of this part of the river speaks to how it's experienced as colonialism. And one of the participants said this. He said, that's one of the biggest impacts that's going unmeasured and unaddressed. You've got a whole community that's really divided because there are 400 or 500 people that have employment there and they need the work, but maybe some of them themselves are conflicted if they are Indigenous and they might have different feelings on the project. Just because they're working there doesn't mean that they like that they're working there. And I think that's a big impact that's going unaddressed. If you get into Indigenous politics, it's kind of like another wave of colonialism. And I think that you'll see that a lot of people will have trauma because of this that will be passed on. And it's really going unacknowledged. I think that's one for me personally, and I think of it as a community. And it might sound sort of extreme to relate a hydro dam to trauma, but this has been documented in other cases in northern Manitoba. Martin Loney, I think it's Martin, has written about Grand Rapids and a few other communities and how it has affected those communities in a traumatic way. He provides a definition by Erickson that says, by collective trauma, I mean a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damage the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of communality. This collective trauma works its way slowly and even insidiously into awareness of those who suffer from it. So it does not have the quality of suddenness normally associated with trauma, but over time these changes people know this and people feel this, and Labradorians explain this to me as they experience it. So even if people didn't necessarily articulate it in terms of Indigenous rights or Indigenous resistance, which a lot of people have, and a lot of people in Labrador have mobilized and have educated themselves. We see it through Tracy's talk this morning. We see it with Roberta's research. Even if people don't use those mainstream ways of discussing what they're feeling and what they're going through, a lot of Labradorians still know that experience. While people talk about their specific rights to specific nations, they also talk about unity and wanting to protect the land for all people. And even if they don't know how to talk about it in those sort of formalized academic terms, they experience it and they tell me how they feel. This feeling of oppression, this feeling that they're not being listened to, this feeling that people want to take away from what they have, their cultures and their communities. People spoke of wanting to see their peoples be able to live on the land and on the river in their own way, on their own terms, as they have for time immemorial. So what I want to close off with saying is, I think that in Newfoundland especially, it kind of gets lost because we're thinking, oh, like they made that agreement in October a couple years ago, there's no such thing as methylmercury, it's all good, or oh, the stuff at the North Spur, I'm sure it's fine, like that's a bunch of whatever. I think we need to get away from like saying, oh, it is an issue or it's not, and instead we need to also be looking at, while all of this doubt and uncertainty is ongoing, and while these changes are ongoing, and while the dam is changing that landscape and that ecosystem, people are experiencing distress and fear and trauma and uncertainty around all of that. And so I think we need to keep in mind when we're talking about it that that's very real for people. I think that people think that it's not an issue anymore, or that it's not serious unless we have very measurable methylmercury effects down the road. But I just wanted to say that I'm very happy and privileged to get to talk to the people that I did. I wish I could just play all their interviews for you because they're much more interesting than me talking, but it is a very real phenomenon. The people in Labrador I talked to were so inspiring with their personal histories of activism, protecting their land, of their culture, and I think we would all like to see that maybe preserved. Thank you.